Why has it taken so long for traditional Shakespeare academics to begin to address the Shakespeare authorship question, while many still adamantly refuse to do so? In 1841, the very popular and highly influential English author Thomas Carlyle published On Heroes and Hero Worship and the Heroic in History, which cemented our understanding of Shakespeare in a romantic vision that continues to this day. According to Carlyle's massively popular 1854 book, still in print with Yale University Press, Shakespeare is a monument to Saxondom, created by nature, not to be meddled with, whatever that means. This book was a nail in the coffin for English Shakespeare studies, and it elevated Shakespeare to a religious cult. Call it worship, call it what you will. Worship means you accept on faith, you do not question. Add to this Roland Barthes' death of the author theory of literary criticism, and you have the perfect storm for ditching historical analysis of literary texts. The current revival of Delia Bacon's 1857 group authorship theory reopens the door to questioning the Shakespeare authorship theory. Unburdened by Carlyle's concept of Shakespeare as an English deity created by nature, French scholars began to question Shakespeare's identity based on a careful historical analysis of the plays, which reveals a complexity impossible for traditional English scholars to acknowledge because it requires knowledge Shakespeare did not have. In 1918, 2 years before Looney's Shakespeare Identified, Abel Lefranc, an internationally respected Renaissance scholar and member of the Académie Française, published a 2-volume study, Sous le masque de William Shakespeare, under the mask of William Shakespeare. Although Lefranc's candidate was William Stanley, with some collaboration from Edward de Vere, Looney and Lefranc were friends and allies for the case against Shakespeare. Charlton Ogburn mentions both Lefranc and Lambin. Lefranc observes historical and psychological reasons Shakespeare could not have been Shakespeare. There are no historical records that indicate Shakespeare was a writer. Neither Henslowe nor Richard Allen, Shakespeare's theatrical business associates, mention him. When Shakespeare dies, there are no testimonials from his contemporaries. Strangely, we have extensive business records, but not literary records. Shakespeare's business records reveal no travel nor knowledge of any foreign language. Shakespeare does not even have a recognizable signature or spelling for his name, unlike every other writer for whom we have signatures. Lefranc observes that English scholars are guilty of changing the spelling of Shakespeare's name to Shakespeare, which is shameful. Serious psychological incongruities are another problem. Unlike what we would expect from a merchant, Shakespeare's works present an aristocratic mindset. The familiarity with which nobles are addressed in the prefaces in Venus and Adonis and Lucrece is absolutely inconceivable for a commoner. The progressive sense of sadness and loss in the plays is contrary to Shakespeare's ever-increasing success. Shakespeare's avarice in business is in opposition to the moral lessons of the plays. Shakespeare sued for 2 shillings, put a school friend in debtor's prison, and even refused to pay his wife's debt, versus the magnanimity of Shakespeare, who proclaimed the quality of mercy is not strained. Shakespeare does nothing to stop pirated editions of his works, which was money lost, and he does nothing to secure his works for posterity, which was more money lost, which are business failures incompatible with his penny-pinching record. Curiously, he stops writing at 45. Despite the fact there is no record Shakespeare traveled abroad, travel is a theme throughout Shakespeare's works. To be educated abroad, to see the world, the belief that a man cannot be accomplished without traveling abroad. None of these ideas about travel are compatible with the life of Shakespeare. Shakespeare's plays also reveal a knowledge of French and Italian geography, which are impossible to explain for someone who had not traveled abroad. A knowledge so extensive that traditional English academics failed to comprehend how much European geography Shakespeare knew, like the Italian canal system or churches dedicated to St. James in France and Italy, as well as Spain. Shakespeare's works are not censored like those of other authors, with the exception of the deposition scene in Richard II, which was cut. But Shakespeare was never punished for sexual, political, or occult subject matter. How did the sonnets and the Rape of Lucrece escape ecclesiastical censorship? Johnson, Chapman, and Nash were all punished for their writings, but not Shakespeare. Regarding the curious timeline of Shakespeare's plays, Lefranc believed the plays were rewritten with no explanation as to why we have variant texts unless they were written for presentation at court and then rewritten for the general public, a concept only recently espoused by traditional academics. For most writers of the period, we have records of their education, but none for Shakespeare. Shakespeare's works reveal an astonishing knowledge of music, the arts, heraldry, horsemanship, ancient and modern authors, science, the secret arts, history, the army, marine law, medicine, the French and English court, French and Italian languages and dialects, aristocratic sports like hunting, falconry, tennis, and fencing, and more neologisms based on French than any other English author, according to Lefranc's English contemporary, Sir Sidney Lee. Much Ado About Nothing has a detailed description of a tapestry of Hercules located in Tournai at the time. Musical compositions, and the importance of music are found throughout the plays. Shakespeare's knowledge of French literary sources, and minor French political figures cannot be explained. Shakespeare did not board with the French Montjoie family, where he supposedly learned French until 1598. But traditional scholars give a 1598 date to Love's Labour's Lost, a play about French nobility in provincial Nérac. Love's Labour's Lost describes details of internal French political deliberations in 1580, for which there was no published record until after Shakespeare's death. Hamlet has a French source for which there was not yet an English translation. Having considered Lefranc's scholastic and psychological observations that prove Shakespeare could not have been Shakespeare, let us examine the historical dimensions of three plays that illustrate Shakespeare was writing with an eye on continental affairs and their importance for England, as observed by Lefranc and his protégé, Georges Lambin, in his 1962 book, Voyage de Shakespeare en France et en Italie. Their historical lens reveals the amazing complexity of Shakespeare's historical, national, and international vision. Shakespeare followed the medieval allegorical tradition, which sees the world simultaneously in multiple dimensions: the literal, allegorical, historical, typological, moral, and anagogic, spiritual or mystical. Let's consider what traditional scholars have labeled problem plays to see if including the French perspective helps clear up some of the issues for which these plays are criticized. All's Well That Ends Well is the story of Helena and Bertram. Helena manages to win the hand of Bertram by curing the king's illness and by tricking Bertram, beating him at his own game. Bertram finds himself forced to marry Helena if he is to keep his word. Bertram flees to fight for the French king in Italy. a reference to the Italian wars dating from 1494 to 1559, a period of political chaos which consumed Francis I of France, Henry VIII, and the Emperor Charles V. The conflict bankrupted England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire. The war Henry VIII joined with dreams of becoming King of England and France resulted in Queen Elizabeth inheriting the loss of Calais, a loss of English prestige, and an empty treasury. Shakespeare adds another political dimension to that of the Italian wars, with characters Waugaman identifies as historical French figures. Spuriot, with a scar on his left cheek, refers to both Francois de Guise and Henry de Guise, father and son, both of whom had the same nickname, Scarface, because both had facial scars from war injuries. Francois de Guise, the father, played a major role in the Italian wars, as well as initiating the war between the French Protestants and Catholics. Francois de Guise's son, Henri de Guise, formed the Catholic League, which sought to dethrone the French king, Henry III. Like the name Spuriot implies, neither Francois nor Henry de Guise could be trusted. Ludovic represents Henry de Guise's brother, Louis II, Cardinal of Lorraine, who also worked to undermine King Henry III. By adding references to the religious wars in France, Shakespeare suggests that the territorial disputes of the previous generation of Henry VIII have now been supplanted by an even greater danger to England, the religious war between French Protestants and Catholics. Religious differences splitting France into warring factions could also split England, just as the Italian wars had split Europe and Italy into warring factions. Waugaman identifies many minor historical characters. Shakespeare's Bertram, Count of Roussillon, almost married Maudlin, daughter of Lafou, as Juste Henri, Count of Roussillon, married Madeleine, daughter of La Rochefoucauld in 1583. Helen is a reference to Helen of Tournon, also found in Love's Labour's Lost and Hamlet. Parolles, the braggart soldier, refers to many historical Frenchmen. Spuriot, with a scarred face, represents Francois and Henri de Guise. Captain Dumaine represents Charles de Lorraine, Duc de Mayenne, the second Guise brother. Ludovic represents Louis, Cardinal of Lorraine, the third Guise brother. And Vaumont represents the Count of Vaudémont. The farcical language of Parolles' captors is based on Languedoc. How incredible that Shakespeare knew the name of so many small players in unpublished French history. How odd that Shakespeare, who never traveled abroad, thought about parodying the sound of Languedoc. Waugaman's historical insights elucidate the political message of all's well. If society is to survive, fealty to the state must prevail, or society disintegrates, as illustrated by the allusions to the Italian wars and the rebellious French Catholics. For an Elizabethan audience, all's well that ends well presented a mirror of the threats they faced, which are the same threats we face today. The danger posed to society when individuals place their group interests above that of the state. However, all's well that ends well considers not only the fealty necessary between the state and society, but also the fealty necessary between the state and the individual. Can the rights of the individual precede those of the state? Bertram finds himself forced to marry Helena in an arranged marriage, which was a lesson Oxford rebelled against, but finally accepted. The audience is left to wonder if all's well that ends well does end well for Bertram and Helena. Will fealty to the state overcome personal interest? Will the flawed hero rise to the occasion? With its imperfect hero and unsettled ending, all's well that ends well, is one of Shakespeare's most modern plays. Elizabethan audiences would have associated the image of a sick king with medieval stories of the Fisher King, whose illness is the symbol of a sick nation. Who saves the king? Not his male physicians, but a woman. The Greek name Helena means moon, and the moon is one of the symbols of Queen Elizabeth. Both Helena and Queen Elizabeth have a problematic lineage, a very touchy subject for Queen Elizabeth, which Shakespeare overcomes when Helena saves the king, the symbol of the nation, despite her inferior lineage. Helena saves the king and the country because she has the necessary skill and courage. Helena and Queen Elizabeth are not merely daughters, but replacements for their fathers. And this being Shakespeare, the master of paradox, the clown Lavache brings up associations with Helen of Troy, whose suitor causes the fall of her kingdom. Comparing Queen Elizabeth to Helen of Troy is a reminder of the dangers suitors posed for Queen Elizabeth, who could lose her power if she married. According to the popular song of the day, Froggy Went A-Courtin', just like Helen of Troy, Queen Elizabeth could be taken off to a foreign country like France if she were to marry. Helena succeeds where the king's most highly regarded men have failed. On an historical and political level, this is a message for Queen Elizabeth's court and those who doubted her ability to rule, as well as a warning about the dangers marriage posed for the queen. To clarify confusion about geography in All's Well, Lombard explains Helena refers to the Church of Great Jacques in order to confuse people about where she is going, a plot device which also confused English scholars who mistook Roussillon with the Spanish territory rather than the French city. Another problem play that gains depth when French scholarship is considered is Measure for Measure, in which Lombard finds a startling number of connections with France. Measure for Measure is the story of Vincent, Duke of Milan, Isabella, a novice, and her brother Claudio, who is sentenced unjustly to death for an illicit liaison with Juliet, his betrothed. Lombard believes that the reference to the dukes, who must either come to agreement with the King of Hungary or attack him, is a veiled reference to the 80 Years' War with Spain and the Habsburgs, united against the Dutch, French, and English, a realignment of the European powers after the Italian Wars, with England now allied with France. The ruler in the play, the Duke Vincentio, decides to retire briefly from governance and spreads the rumor that he has gone to Poland. Henry III, the French king, went to Poland to serve as the Polish king until he was crowned king of France in 1575. Lombard observes that Henry III's royal lineage dates back to Saint Louis, which explains why Shakespeare has Vincentio choose Ludovico for his name as a friar. Shakespeare also uses the name Louis for the French Dauphin in King John. The opening of the play depicts Vienna as debauched. The French court of Henry III was dissolute. Shocking the French, Henry III and his minions broke fashion codes by wearing artificially curled hair, bright colors, strings of pearls, earrings, and, quote, velvet bonnets like the whores in the brothels. Lucio says of the Duke, I never heard the absent Duke much detected for women. He was not inclined that way. This remark refers to Henry III's reputation for flagrant homosexuality, unacceptable at the time, and to his failure to have a child. Paradoxically, Henry III was also known for his extreme religiosity, dressing as a monk and flagellating himself, as would his minions. He went on frequent religious retreats. Lombard observes Henry III's sought to be a true believer, just as the Duke Vincentio wishes to be a true friar. The city of Vienna is Paris, barely disguised. The Duke represents the French king, Henry III, who was briefly considered as a husband for Queen Elizabeth before his brother Alençon became her last suitor in 1579. Lombin discovers links between Isabella's convent and the order of Saint Clare, which had a convent at Longchamp in the Bois de Boulogne, where the Paris racetrack now stands. The Longchamp order of Saint Clare had mitigated, that is, relaxed rules. Indeed, Isabella says she wishes the rules of her order were stricter. Shakespeare makes the mitigated rules clear when Lucio says, "Behold, behold, where Madam Mitigation comes. I have purchased as many diseases under her roof with a French crown." The term Madame Mitigation parodies l'histoire des ordres monastiques, the history of monastical orders, which specifies that there are St. Clare monasteries with and without mitigation. Shakespeare mocks not only the debauchery of Paris and its king, but even its nunneries. In 1582, in a story which was not put into print until after Shakespeare's death, Claude Tonnerre was sentenced to death by corrupt Parisian officials for an illicit sexual relationship despite a marriage agreement. Claude was saved by an uprising of Parisians and clerks. After a period of seclusion in a monastery, King Henry III returned to Paris and was informed about the case. Historical names mirrored in the play include not only Claudio, but Jérôme Angenoust Angelo, whom Henry III had appointed as his administrator before leaving on his religious retreat, just as in the play. Also, La Roche-Flavin, Flavius, Vere, Varius, Saint-Luc, Lucio, who slandered the king, as does Lucio, Bernardino, and Ragazzoni. So that's quite a list of historical characters. Shakespeare also mentions the provost of the prison, who not only guards the prison, but also makes arrests, which was only the case in France, not in Vienna or England. Lombin examines Shakespeare's detailed knowledge of the road between Paris and Longchamp, which was only 6.2 miles, as well as discerning slightly disguised names of Henri's minions, a wealth of details that Shakespeare could not possibly have known. Isabella's refusal to sacrifice her virginity to save her brother mirrors that of the founder of the French Order of Saint Clare, Isabelle de France, who refused the king's order to marry because of her vow of chastity. The French Isabelle's surprising resistance to royal authority mirrors that of Shakespeare's heroine Isabella. Both Isabella and Queen Elizabeth define virginity as key to their identity. The emphasis on Queen Elizabeth's virginity became a dominant theme in the 1580s when all hope for Elizabeth bearing a child was lost. What was Shakespeare's message to the Queen and her courtly audience? The French court was corrupt. The French king was unstable. France could not be trusted. A sobering message as England found itself allied with the French and the Dutch against the Habsburgs, Spain, and Portugal. Isabella's lack of an answer to the Duke's marriage proposal serves as a political message that France was unreliable and a warning that marriage would result in a loss of independence for Queen Elizabeth. The predominance of Italian names in Measure for Measure's Vienna suggests the play mirrors Italy's decline, a warning of what can happen to a country when outsiders take over its politics. Shakespeare often uses names of various ethnicities, which are not necessarily related to the location of his plays. His use of ethnically diverse names suggests Shakespeare wanted to create not simply a national perspective, but a European vision and ultimately a universal interpretation for his plays. Love's Labour's Lost. To this day, traditional academics maintain there's no obvious source for Love's Labour's Lost, the play which presents the French court and the battle of wits between male and female courtiers. Lefranc observes the characters are historical members of French nobility. Navarre represents the King of Navarre. Baron is Charles de Gontaut, Baron de Biron. Longueville is Henri d'Orléans, Duc de Longueville. Dumaine is the Duc de Maine. In addition, the French nobleman, to the French nobleman, we also find French vocabulary, l'envoi, sang, and bran. Bran was the French dance favored by Marie de Navarre, the queen in the play. The interesting description of Navarre's note with writing all on the edges is a trait observed in King Henry of Navarre's historical letters. The Civil War of Wit is a reference to the French religious wars. There is also a reference to Navarre's horsemanship, for which he was very famous. There's a peculiar reference to a meeting at the Duke of Alençon's, and Marguerite de Valois went to Brabant in 1578 to promote her brother's claim to the throne just before her trip to Nerac. There's a puzzling reference to a damsel who died there of a broken heart, and this is a reference to the historical Mademoiselle de Tournon, who played a part in Marguerite's entourage in Brabant, and actually was rejected by her lover there and died of a broken heart in 8 days. And this story was so shocking that it was suppressed and not printed until 1628. The story also appears in Hamlet. For those who are familiar with gossip about the French court, it gets even more intriguing. The King of Navarre was known for his constant affairs, not for his vows of celibacy. The Queen traveled with a hand group picked group of the most beautiful women at court, who were called l'escadron volant, or the flying squadron, a military term, because the Queen used them to either facilitate or derail negotiations. When they arrived invited or uninvited, the Queen insisted that several days be spent socializing before any negotiations could begin, in order to put the negotiators in a relaxed frame of mind, or the contrary, depending on how the Queen felt about the issues. Lefranc is even able to identify some of the ladies in waiting. Love's Labour's Lost is not only an accurate rendition of an important diplomatic endeavor the French referred to as la guerre des amoureux, the lovers' war, but also a comedy about the French court. The French called the Treaty of Flix, which ended the war, la traité des amoureux, the lovers' treaty. When everything fell apart with Marguerite's departure from Nerac, it was indeed Love's Labour's Lost. None of this was published until after Shakespeare's death. The play has been criticized because of its ending with the death of the king. Shakespeare actually telescoped history by less than 10 years to make the questions more dramatic. And they are, what have you done with your life, and have you prepared for the next generation? For Queen Elizabeth, the message is brutal. Do not leave England like France without an heir. Knowing the character's history enriches their humanity and our ability to identify with them. Yet again, we see how Shakespeare takes an historical source and adapts it to offer lessons on multiple levels. And in conclusion, I think the most important thing I can say here is that the rebirth of the group theory of authorship is an opportunity for Oxfordians that needs to be cultivated carefully. Lefranc believed the plays were written for court and then rewritten for the public. De Vere could have left the reworking of his plays for the general public to members of his coterie of writers. A comparison could be made with the art atelier of the great Renaissance painters. It was the master who did the design, controlled the process, the style, and ultimately the finished work of art. The work of assistants had to match that of the master artist who oversaw everything. The Renaissance was still a time of strict hierarchy and control, as illustrated by its painting workshops. In addition to the rebirth of group authorship theory, which can open doors for Oxfordians, reintroducing the French public to Shakespeare's obsession with France could reawaken French interest in Shakespeare, which was lost when traditional English Shakespeare scholars suppressed or ignored French scholarship on Shakespeare. Revealing the importance of French history in the plays and the importance of past French scholarship could bring the French back to Shakespeare. If we invite them in, they could dramatically increase the impact of the Oxfordian movement. Shakespeare was not merely an entertainer, he was also a political messenger armed with history. In closing, I would like to inform everyone that Frank Lawler is working on an English translation of Le Fran's first 2 volumes. Thank you so much.